Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Salotto Italiano. Tonight, we have our guest speaker, Mr. Alan Balboni, here with us. He is a political scientist and political scientist and book author of Beyond the Mafia, right? Let me ask you, what was the inspiration behind the book?
Excuse me. Basically, the inspiration behind the book was my maternal grandfather, Giovanni Antonio Scanga. He was born in Calabria, in a place called Lago. I think almost everyone here knows that at the time he was born, it was the poorest area of Italy. It still is. He came here when he was roughly 10 years old and saw some of the challenging times, tough times that so many of your grandparents and great-grandparents saw. He lived through periods of great hostility to Italian immigrants, and at that time, Italian, Greek, Slavic, and Eastern European Jewish immigrants. Some of you know that the immigration laws were between 1916 and 1924 tightened
Yes.
to prevent more and more of those people from those four groups from coming into the country. I mention that particularly in light of what is occurring today and has occurred periodically throughout our history. Yes, we're a nation of immigrants, but we're also a nation whose history periodically the immigrants become very much resented. What's happening now is not new. It occurred in regard to the Irish Catholics, as many of you know, and a variety of other groups, and even we went so far as to define, we had an Asian exclusion zone in 1917. We said this is the Asian. No one from this area can come to the United States and be a citizen. Anyhow, I'm giving you too much of a scholarly answer, and that
no, you know okay. We love
that happens. It's like asking Mr. Casaro about plumbing or something. You know, then you can't hold him back after a while. But the inspiration was that my grandfather educated himself, valued higher education, was not able to go on to college or university. But he took courses at what was called the Harvard Extension. The Harvard at night had an extension program, and he showed me the notes that he took. He died when I was 12 years old. He showed me the notes he took in his economics classes. You know, and later on I said, well, these are not much has changed in economics. The basic principles stay the same. And he would talk to me about the history, and he was very proud of being Italian. He was also realistic about some of the pluses and minuses, things that were going on in the neighborhood. He became a neighborhood leader. He organized a school center, and after, in the evening, a school center, particularly for the younger people to go and to get some education, play some sports, and do that sort of thing. And so so I don't go on forever, I still remember very vividly him telling me about American history, which he had learned himself. He talked about some of the things that I mentioned, and he spoke. He said, you know, immigrant group comes in, they face prejudice, they face discrimination. He said 30, 40 years later, the children of those immigrants, many of them unfortunately become prejudiced. He says, I hope this doesn't happen with the Italians, but it probably will. It probably like every other group. And he spoke to me about, he took me down to the North End, the Italian section of Boston, and many of you acquainted with that. And he spoke highly of so many of the people who work so hard so that their children could do better. And then at the end, he said, and I have to mention this too, there's a very few young men that bring shame to the community by their behavior. He said, that's terrible. My grandmother then, who had been quiet, said, there's only one thing worse, John, than those young men. It's the young women who keep company with those young men.
That's true.
So that was the basic inspiration to do something, and then coming to Las Vegas. I came to Las Vegas on a visit with my wife, who's in the audience here, and I think it was in '77 or some such thing. And we're moving around the casinos and we're in the restaurants, and they're paging people. In those days, they
Yes.
did more paging than they used to. I turned to my wife and I said, you notice about 80–90% of these pages are either from people of my background or your background. My wife is Eastern European Jewish, so it's either a Jewish name or an Italian name. I didn't hear any Irish names, that kind of thing. So that was fascinating, and I fell in love with Las Vegas on that visit. I didn't confess that to my wife till later when I had the job offer. But in any event, come out here, and I could see that the Italian Americans had done so much for Las Vegas, but it wasn't being recorded. And of course, being a professor, I think, well, this should be recorded. And initially, I thought, well, someone with more talent than I should record it. But then I said, well, there's probably a lot of people with more talent, but they're not interested in recording it. So I began by writing first articles and so forth, and then I could see a possibility of moving it into a book. And I was inspired by the thought that the Italian-American contribution here is considerable in so many areas.
Yes.
It needs to be recorded. It needs to be recorded in a university press book, because I had some other opportunities. I said, no, doing this through a university press is, if there's any other professors in the audience, you deal with the university press, you pay a price. But I said, it's worth it. It's worth it to get it done by a university press.
And we're going to talk about that. But before we talk about the community and the growth, but about the title, why the choice of Beyond the Mafia?
I remember the phone conversation. Now, here I am.
You have a great memory.
Yeah, I do. With all humility, I have to say that. But in any event, here we are in, I don't know, the book. The original came out in '96, and probably in '94 or something like that. And I've been struggling through this whole thing, and I get a phone call from the marketing director at the University of Nevada Press. She basically paraphrased. She says, "Well, Professor Balboni, are you sitting down?" I said, "Well, yes, I'll sit down. What's happening?" She said, "No, I don't want you to get excited. I want you to get excited. I want you to think about this." And she said, "You're playing with the title like Italian Americans in the Development of Las Vegas. Add the words at the top, Beyond the Mafia." I said, "Oh, I don't like that word. That word has hurt so many Italian Americans." She said, "I don't deny that. I don't deny that." She said, "Let me ask you a question. What's your goal?" I said, my goal is to get the book out there and have people read the book, look at the book, and appreciate." She said, "You want to achieve that goal, you won't get half the people if you have a title, Italian Americans in Development of Las Vegas. You put in there the mafia word." I know you don't like that word, but you put in there the mafia word, and people, as they're walking by in the bookstore and whatnot, say, "Oh, what is this?" And they'll open up the book, and some of them will learn, and isn't that your goal? So at the end of the conversation, I said, well, at the beginning, I didn't think you'd convince me of this, but reluctantly, that's the title.
Yes.
That's
well,
why.
I guess the word beyond is as important as mafia, because
certainly is.
Otherwise it would be just the usual stereotype.
That's right.
Exactly.
That's right. I try to avoid that.
Exactly. So in the book, you describe the important roles that the Italian American community has had in the growth of Las Vegas. Can you highlight some of these roles?
One would think, if one really didn't have any background when was coming to Las Vegas, and what would be the Italian contribution, Italian American contribution, and you'd think first of food, and you know what, you should, because you can go back in the period, the early period, roughly 1910 to the beginning of World War II. The population of Italian ancestry, birth or ancestry, was under 2%. And many of you know the population was very low as it is, so there weren't many people of Italian birth or ancestry, but you had the situation where you had someone from the Barozzi family, and I'm looking at Mr. Piccoli when I say that, actually opened Cafe Roma briefly in the 30s, and you had another restaurant. You had another restaurant downtown. You had the Ruvo family
Yes.
coming in, the Ruvo and the Peri, if I can pronounce it somewhat Italian, Perri, anyhow, and opening restaurants. The people I spoke with, interviewed people from the great growth period in the late 50s and 60s. They talked about a place, Luigi's, not spelled as one might think, but that's a separate story. But in any event, it was really the place to go. And then there was the Villa d'Este,
Yes.
and they were just anyone talking, and they didn't have to be Italian, and they talk about the situation, in Vegas in the 50s, and during this tremendous growth period, the 50s and 60s. They mentioned the Italian restaurants were really the places to go. Even downtown, you had someone, Pietro Orlando Silvani, who incidentally was Calabrese, point that out, but in any event, who came in from Utah. He's a contractor in Utah, and he had visited Las Vegas just as the work on the dam was being commenced and so forth, and he saw tremendous potential. And this is his person I interviewed. His daughter said he borrowed from everyone in the family. He borrowed from everyone he knew. He even borrowed from people he didn't know because he saw the potential, and he bought the property where Binion's place is now. And one of the things that he did was, once again, excellent restaurant there. It was really the place to go. So we use the term today, the hospitality industry. And so if you're thinking of food and drink and entertainment, the Italians, yes. Italian Americans and the Italian bond, they just play a key role. Now, another area where, coming from the East, you yes. say, well, it must have been construction too, because when I was growing up, the Italians were moving ahead in
yes.
When I use the term Italians, I'm actually usually meaning Italian Americans.
Yes.
They're moving ahead in the construction industry, and so there was the Catello family in terms of marble. There was a painting contractor did a lot of work, and his name was Sam, and I would pronounce it DiBiase. But when I talked to people, they said, Professor, no, everyone called him Sam DeBase. He learned early on that people here couldn't handle DiBiase.
Yes, exactly.
DeBase. Sam DeBase. So he's a prominent painting contractor. And then there was Gus Raponi with the Sierra Construction. And
so constructions and food.
Construction,
two main
construction,
roles.
Food.
Yes.
And then once again, when I grew up back east, at that time, the Italian Americans played a prominent role in disposing of waste and hauling and this sort of thing.
Waste
and
management,
so
yes.
I mentioned in the book the role, the great role of the Sola family, and some of you may recognize that name. It's all corporate now, the waste disposal, but the Sola family came in from the Bay Area, where they had been in that business, and they served for many decades, and I think they did it well. I think they did a darn good job. And so you have representation in that. Now, last but not least, you can't think about the Italians without thinking about entertainment.
Of course. Yes.
And do you want me to talk about that now?
Not yet. I'd like to ask you about.
I had a feeling not yet. That's why I put it that way.
No, I would like to ask you. This book has been published in 1996, right?
Yes.
Now, 20 years passed basically from the first time it was published. How do you see the role of Italian American community now? What is the legacy that you've seen after 20 years? If you had to write the book nowadays, what is the legacy that you would find?
Well, I'm gonna speak to that. I'm not sure it's
okay.
I'm not sure it's the response that you want for this question.
But
then you can follow up.
Okay, sure. I'll do my best.
Some years ago, I was talking, as I often did, because every time I talked to him, I learned something with Angelo Casaro.
Yes.
And I used the word assimilation. He said, "Oh, Professor, what a mouthful that is." He said, what a word that is. He said, what the devil is that? And so I give him an explanation of assimilation, the concept of assimilation. And he had a wonderful response. He said, oh, that's like the Irish out here. In other words, where he and I grew up, you knew who was Irish. Out here, it's hard to find anyone who really identifies as Irish. They're intermixed with other groups. The connection with Ireland, with some exceptions,
Yes.
is pretty weak. So they become, assimilated. So I think that we must accept that if we go back to the early period where there were not that many, there were only less than 2% of the population was of Italian background. And yes, many of those people knew one another. Sometimes they get together for a picnic up on Mount Charleston, or they get together for drinks, they get together as family and whatnot. But there's only 2% of the population. So what happens to the children? With rare exception, the children do not marry people of Italian background. So then their children are of some kind of mixed background.
Yes.
I remember some time ago, I think it was at the Italian-American Club. It was at a table there, they were serving the food. There were about 10 people around, and I said something more in this vein that over time the connection with Italy is likely to fade. It might fade more slowly because of the excellent work you folks are doing.
Thank you.
But fade it will, to be perfectly frank, to try to be scholarly. So I was saying that, and there was some resistance at the table, which is kind of healthy. That's good. It's all, Professor. I said, well, let's try this. I said, put up your hand if your children married people of Italian background. I don't think 2 hands went up out of 10. So that's
interesting. Yeah.
That's what's occurring. What the people of Italian background going way back and more recently, and now we have a new infusion. We have people like yourself and others who've born and brought up in Italy and giving an infusion to the culture, and that's important. And that certainly will have some positive
Yes.
effect. But the fact that most people of Italian now, do I go off the track a little bit? But that's all right. That's what I do. I taught for many years. So with Angelo, I took a course. We had a course at the Italian-American Club in basic Italian. Then we take a second semester and a third. So I learned how to read some and so. Anyhow, long story short, I was getting ready to meet the relatives in Italy and show them some respect by speaking a little Italian. So what I began doing when I'd read the roster of the students at the beginning of the class, if I come across an Italian name, I pronounce it, the last name, the Italian way. Here's the reaction usually. What? Well, they come up after class and said, I think my grandfather pronounced it that way, but we don't
pronounce it anymore.
We don't
Exactly.
we don't pronounce it that way,
anymore.
And some of them got a kick out of it, and some of them look at me strangely, like, well, what do you? Never heard that. Never heard that before. And then sometimes I would talk to them a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say something like, "Well, that's interesting. What region did your parents family come from?" And more as the years went by, more and more said, "I don't know. I'm not sure. Could have been Sicily, but it could have been what's that city in the north, Milan? I mean, it is,
They didn't know.
They didn't know. So that's not an indictment of them or anyone else, and it's good that there's a revitalization and that sort of thing. But that's what America eventually. You have this kind of you have this kind of assimilation.
Yes, and actually really that was going to be my next question about the assimilation process. Do you think that is it different today from what it was years ago when the first Italian immigrants came over from Italy? Is it different type of process in terms of assimilation? Maybe
really,
it's easier now than it was. What do you think?
Well,
your opinion.
The situation, the circumstances of the first people of Italian birth or ancestry who came to Las Vegas, the few, was different than Italian immigrants going to Boston, Philadelphia, Buffalo, Chicago, Baltimore. You get the picture.
Yes.
First of all, there were very few.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you have an immigrant group, you have very few and I'm making a generalization, and you know, there's a sociology professor in the audience. He can disagree with me later. I don't care. But that's all right. He might agree with me. But generally, if you have an immigrant group and they speak different language, and they did the food, if there's only a few, there's less resentment. If there's a lot, the resentment goes up, even faster than proportionately to generalize. So the treatment by the power structure of people of Italian birth or ancestry was pretty darn good. It was much better than it was on the East Coast. Because on the East Coast, you go back to the newspapers, say in 1910, 1920, you had statements in the newspapers and in magazines, not only common people, but well-educated people say, the Italians will never make good American citizens. They'll never be good citizens. They don't have our value structure. They'll never be able to do this and that. Their children are delinquents. Their children drop out, and of course, the Italian rate of dropping out of school was extraordinary. I mean, it was higher than virtually all the other immigrant groups for a long time. So you had a really contentious situation for them. Not much in Las Vegas. In my book, I point out there was one newspaper article that poked a little fun at the Italian immigrants and the Greek immigrants when they got into a fist fight on the railroad or some kind of thing. But other than that, it was pretty positive, and you had people born in Italy accepted as leaders in the community. Or there was the Pichetto and the Graudia. They open a bar, and the son becomes a pharmacist and whatnot. And they're and Champo, they're accepted almost completely. Nothing is ever complete, but so much a high level of acceptance. Quite a contrast to the East Coast. Now, in general, the historians point out that on the West Coast, in general, the Italians were able to be more accepted, more willingly accepted in general than on the East Coast for a variety of reasons. And I think that was even more pronounced in Las Vegas. So that, which was terrific. I mean, that was great. That was
absolutely.
great.
So you mentioned obviously Las Vegas, and you mentioned before about being the capital of entertainment. Now, what is your perception of cultural growth in Las Vegas nowadays?
And of course, I asked you about that
yes.
a little bit before to make sure we were on the same.
Of course.
The same way, I said, if I remember my Anthropology 101, the anthropologist defined culture just about as everything that's done, everything that's thought of, everything that's planned, and everything in the past.
Yes.
But I think you're talking about like art, music, and things of that
Las Vegas
sort.
is obviously changing,
right?
Slowly, but it's changing. So
my perception is that sure. I mean, I got the Smith Center and whatnot. But I also remember, and I always tell stories. I remember, and I'm trying to think back to when it was. It was probably around the early 1990s. And there was on the faculty at the College of Southern Nevada a person, his name was Nick Horn. He had started out in the Assembly, and moved up into the State Senate and got on the Finance Committee, which is the power committee. But in any event, he had an idea, which was to raise the room tax in order to finance a really first-class art museum. Well, the story I heard is that some of the people, the movers and shakers on the Strip, took him aside, said, "Nick, this is Las Vegas.
Oh.
You don't do that." I bet you remember. You probably remember. You probably remember. Forget it and stop talking about it.
Oh, okay.
Stop talking about that. So Las Vegas has grown, I believe, because it answers the demand for really popular entertainment. Now, we have a big population now. When I come here, 800,000 people in the whole valley. The growth is just absolutely extraordinary. So yes, we'll support more of, in the narrow sense, cultural opportunities that'll continue. But I think the people who make the big decisions, they don't want to take us away from what the mass of people want.
Of course.
That's crucial. And I
Yes.
think we've, we've really answered that. Even the period, the growth of what euphemistically was called, or still is, men's clubs, men coming in and whatnot. And now I guess, because I'm an old timer, so I'm not up on this stuff, that you get a lot of younger people coming
Yes.
in, sort of a partying culture.
Yes.
But that's what they want. So we got to deliver that.
Well,
not
that's for
lose
the
sight
tourists.
of that.
No,
Not lose sight of
absolutely.
that.
Do you think the local community is ready for more culture in Las Vegas? What is your opinion on
Well,
that?
the folks seated here would like me to say a strong yes.
Well, I hope so.
I don't want to bet the house on it.
Okay.
But I do
All
have
right.
I do have a truck that's 20 years old. I'll bet that on it. But
Yes.
I mean, once again, I think that Las Vegas is Las Vegas, and Las Vegas should not try to be something else.
Something else. No, absolutely. Still is the capital
There's
of entertainment.
no reason
No.
that the Smith Center cannot thrive, and that undertakings of this sort, and there may be other ethnic groups that are doing something similar, cannot thrive. There's no question about it. We have the population base, but
Yes.
never lose sight of why we are.
No,
why
absolutely,
we
we
got
can't.
to be where we
We
are.
won't be able to.
Yes.
Now, on a more personal note instead, let's talk about you. So, and this is a question that I usually ask every single guest. If you were to identify yourself with something that is Italian, like a car brand or a particular type of food or a region, what would you be and why?
I mentioned my maternal grandfather, Giovanni Antonio Scanda, from Calabria.
Yes.
My name, of course, is Balboni.
Yes.
And you may know, and some others, if you go to Cento, between Bologna and Ferrara, the most common name in Cento is Balboni.
Balboni.
And that I visited the relatives in Cento, and they have the books of the history of the sort of the family. And I would even say, as I look at it, I think the tribe. And I recall before my father died, he reminded me of several other family names that were close to the Balbonis in Italy. And I don't remember all. I remember Barafaldi and Brambilla.
Okay.
Those
yes,
two.
Brambilla. Yes,
and
exactly.
there was a
yes.
couple more, like I forgot. I should point out my father was half of Irish background, so he reminded me too that the McGonagalls were close to the Kellys and the Lynches in County Donegal. But that's not for tonight, right? Okay, but in any event, what I'm getting at is I knew the history of Bologna.
Yes.
And the Italians say the first medical school was in Bologna.
Yes.
But the French say that the first medical school was in Paris. But I don't try to settle that. But in any event, going to Bologna and seeing the university and walking around the bookstores, and when I did that, I was at my maximum knowledge of Italian. I wasn't speaking it or understanding it well, but I could read it pretty well. All of that was I was very impressed with that. I guess that's an answer you would expect from a professor. I mean, that was a center of learning, a center of education,
yes,
still
culture,
respected. The Balboni family, the people that I was related to, value education. Most of the young people, not all, but most of the young people, they get a master's degree in mechanical engineering or electrical engineering, and they really value the education. And so I feel very much attached to
the concept,
that.
To the city of Bologna.
Yeah, and
yes.
I should mention in passing, I've mentioned the relatives coming from the area of Bologna, more specifically Cento, and then the Calabria, and my maternal grandmother, her parents came from the Genoa area. And so
another beautiful city, yes.
Every once in a while, my grandmother would say to me, "Don't forget the Genoese, they're the smartest. Have you heard that? You've heard that? Some of you may be Genoese background. You say, hear it, I believe it.
Exactly.
So I have that. I feel that strong
connection.
that
strong connection to Bologna.
Yeah,
Excellent.
that's right.
Well, I wanted to thank you, but before letting you go, I just wanted to present you with this certificate, and I'll promise I'll make the correction, because once you see it, you'll see why I need to correct it. But it's just a certificate to recognize you, present it to you to recognize you for in promoting Italian culture in this community. So we want to thank you on behalf of Casa Italiana di Las Vegas.
Oh, thank you. You don't have to change that because it's okay. I just, if someone asks me officially, to say, well, my degrees are in my major, that's a good term to use, all the way through political science, all the way through minor.
Okay, so I don't have to change,
history.
but I still want to present you with this.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful the way it is.
Thank
you don't have to change anything.
Thank you so much for
Grazie
giving me
mille.
Grazie a lei, grazie.